texts outside of the scriptures make this explicit, that the ongoing ritual life of these people involved human sacrifice, and human sacrifice involved cannibalism.
Yes.
We have a very skewed view of we haven't done a lot of animal sacrifice and seen a lot of it, so we have kind of a skewed.
Genesis 6 does not begin with a flood. It begins with a silence so heavy that most readers walk past it without stopping. 4 verses that sit inside one of the most studied books in human history, and yet they carry a question that theologians, historians, and ordinary believers have never fully answered. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, and they came to them, and children were born from that union. And those children became the Nephilim mighty ones, men of renown who walked the earth before the waters came. Read it again. Slowly. The Bible does not explain who the sons of God were. It does not explain how this was possible. It does not say what kind of beings crossed that line between the heavenly and the human. It simply states what happened and then moves forward toward Noah, toward the ark, toward the rain, as if the reader is supposed to already understand what was just described. Most people do not pause there. Most people have read Genesis 6 dozens of times and moved on within seconds, drawn forward by the more familiar story of the flood, the animals, the 40 days. The Nephilim get 2 sentences. 2 sentences, and then the narrative accelerates. But what if those 2 sentences are the most important detail in the entire chapter? Hi viewers, before we go any further, tell us in the comments, did you grow up reading Genesis 6? And did anyone ever stop to explain who the Nephilim actually were? Because here is what most Sunday school lessons never taught. Here is what most church sermons pass over in a single breath. The ancient world did not pass over it. The ancient world stopped at exactly that passage and asked the same question being asked right now, and one ancient tradition wrote an entire book in response to it. That book did not vanish. It did not burn. It did not disappear into the ash of forgotten libraries. It survived. It survived in a place far from Rome, far from Constantinople, far from the European church councils that shaped the Bible most Western readers hold today. And what it says about the sons of God, about the Nephilim, about the world before the flood is not a rumor. It is not an internet conspiracy. It is an ancient text, and it has been waiting. The book has a name most Western Christians have never spoken inside a church building. First Enoch, the Book of Enoch, named after the man Genesis itself describes as someone who walked with God and was taken not dying like other men, but simply gone, translated, removed from the earth while still alive. That detail alone should raise every hair on the back of the neck. But here is what hits harder. In the United States, in the United Kingdom, across most of Europe and the Americas, if a believer walks into a church and asks the pastor about the Book of Enoch, the most common response is confusion. Some pastors wave it away politely. Some call it apocryphal. Some say it was rejected by the early church. Some say it was never meant to be scripture. And then there is Ethiopia. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions on earth, with roots stretching back to the 1st century, the Book of Enoch is not a mystery. It is not a controversy. It is not something discovered through a late-night internet search. It is scripture. It sits inside the Ethiopian biblical canon, alongside Genesis, Psalms, Isaiah, and the Gospels. Priests read from it. Monks copy it. Children in religious education encounter it. It has been part of that tradition for over 1,000 years, preserved in the Ge'ez language, the ancient liturgical language of the Ethiopian Church, copied by hand through centuries of worship and devotion. Think about what that means. While most of the Western Christian world was building a canon that left Enoch outside the ordinary Bible, another ancient Christian community, one of the oldest in the world, kept it inside. Not because of rebellion, not because of ignorance, but because of faithfulness to a tradition that stretched back further than most Western churches can trace their own roots. This is not a story about one side being right and another being wrong. That is too simple and too cheap for what the history actually shows. This is a story about memory, about how faith communities remember differently, about how sacred texts travel unevenly across centuries, languages, and geographies, and how what one tradition forgets, another tradition preserves by candlelight. The question is not whether Ethiopia was right to keep Enoch. The question is what Enoch actually says. And what it says about the events of Genesis 6, about those sons of God, about those Nephilim, about the world before the flood is far heavier than most people are prepared to hear. The book of Enoch does not soften Genesis 6. It opens it up. It reaches inside that two-sentence mystery and pulls out a full account, names, ranks, choices, consequences that reads less like mythology and more like a detailed record of a catastrophic spiritual event. In the Enochic tradition, the beings who cross the boundary in Genesis 6 are called the Watchers. The name itself carries meaning. These were not wild or undisciplined beings. They were sentinels. They were assigned, they had a post, a responsibility, a place within the order of creation. The ancient text describes them as members of a heavenly assembly, beings of knowledge, beings of rank, who looked down at the earth and made a decision that unraveled everything. Their leader, according to the text, was named Shemi-Haza. He did not act alone. The book of Enoch records that 200 watchers descended together, a coordinated act, not a single moment of weakness. They came down on a mountain called Hermon, a mountain that exists in the real world, still visible today on the border between modern Syria and Lebanon. They made an oath together. They swore they would not abandon one another regardless of what followed. That detail is more disturbing than the descent itself, because it means they knew exactly what they were doing. This was not confusion. This was not an accident of creation. This was deliberate. 200 beings with full knowledge of the boundary they were crossing, and they crossed it anyway.
Nephilim. And they've survived. And they're living in, they're very primitive. They're feral. They're hostile. And they're very dangerous.
Children were born from the union that followed. The book of Enoch calls these offspring the Nephilim, and the description it gives is terrifying, not because of fantasy imagery, but because of what they represent. They were not fully one thing or another. They existed between two worlds, and they consumed. The ancient text describes them devouring everything the earth could produce, and then turning on the earth itself, and then turning on one another. Read that carefully. The violence in Genesis 6, the corruption, the breaking of the earth is not described in Enoch as random chaos. It is described as the consequence of a specific choice made by specific beings who understood the cost and acted anyway. That reframes everything. The flood in Genesis is not just a story about water. If the Enochic tradition is taken seriously as an ancient interpretation of Genesis 6, and ancient Jewish and early Christian communities clearly did take it seriously, then the flood is a response to something far older than rain. It is a response to a broken boundary. And the Watchers did not only bring themselves when they descended, they brought something with them. Something they had no right to give away. Knowledge arrived before the floodwaters did. The book of Enoch does not present the Watchers simply as beings who crossed a line and disappeared. It presents them as teachers. And that is where the account moves from disturbing into something that demands full attention, because what they taught was not neutral. The Enochic text names one Watcher in particular as the central figure of forbidden instruction. His name is Azazel, and according to the ancient account, Azazel taught humanity things they were not equipped to hold. He taught men the making of swords, the crafting of shields, the cutting of blades. He taught women the art of adornment, cosmetics, jewelry, the enhancement of appearance in ways the text frames as tied to corruption rather than beauty. The ancient account describes these teachings not as gifts, but as violations, knowledge placed into human hands before human conscience had grown large enough to carry it responsibly. Pause there for a moment, and let that land in the present. The United States alone spends hundreds of billions of dollars every year on weapons, technology, and the beauty industry. This is not an accusation. It is an observation. Because the Enochic warning was never that metalworking or adornment were evil in themselves. The warning was about the sequence, about what happens when knowledge outpaces wisdom, about what happens when beings with power pour capability into a world that has not yet developed the moral foundation to use it without destroying itself. In the Enochic framework, Azazel is the symbol of that exact failure. Knowledge transferred without holiness attached to it, capability handed to humanity before humanity had developed the restraint to hold it properly. The ancient text is graphic about the result. The earth did not simply become violent in a general sense. The Enochic account describes specific corruption spreading from the knowledge Azazel distributed corruption that compounded, that multiplied, that embedded itself into human civilization like a root that keeps growing even after the tree above it is cut down. And the text does not let Azazel off the hook with silence. It records a divine judgment specifically directed at him. When the heavenly response finally comes in the Enochic narrative, Azazel is bound. He is cast into darkness. He is covered under rock and stone in a desert place and told he will remain there until the day of judgment. That is not a minor moment in the text. That is an entire theology of accountability, the idea that forbidden knowledge has a source, and the source will answer for what it released. The earth cried out, and the cry was heard, but not before the damage had already become irreversible. Genesis 6, verse 11. Short, direct, almost unbearable in its plainness. The earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence, no elaboration. No explanation of how it got there. Just a statement of condition the way a doctor reads a final diagnosis aloud and then waits for the room to process it. The earth was corrupt. The earth was filled with violence. That is the summary of an entire civilization that the Bible gives in 11 words. The book of Enoch does not let 11 words carry that weight alone. It fills in the space between the Watcher's descent and the flood's arrival with something that feels less like mythology and more like a collapse caught in slow motion. The Nephilim, the offspring of the Watchers and the daughters of men, grew. The ancient text describes them as consuming everything the earth could produce. When the earth's resources ran out, they turned on the animals. When that was not enough, they turned on humanity. When that failed to satisfy, the text says they turned on one another. This was not random chaos. This was systemic. This was what happens when power has no boundary and size has no accountability. The Nephilim were not simply large. They were ungovernable beings who existed outside the ordinary structures that kept human society functional. And the ordinary human beings living among them had no shelter from it. Think about what that world looked like from the ground. A person wakes up in the morning, and the violence that filled their world was not coming from somewhere distant or abstract. It was walking through their fields. It was standing at their door. There was no institution to appeal to, no authority large enough to stop what had been unleashed. The line between the powerful and the helpless had been erased, not slowly, but completely. Genesis does not romanticize that era. It does not call it complex or nuanced. It calls it corrupt. It calls it full of violence. And then it says God looked at it.
Them as these evil, wicked tyrants and thugs who are leading people to destruction, to chaos, right? Genesis says that it gets to the point where every thought of humanity is always evil all the time, right? That's, yeah.
The flood is not presented in Genesis as a sudden decision. In the Enochic framework, the cry of the earth preceded the judgment. The text describes the cries of humanity rising upward, the sound of a world that has been broken by something it did not choose and could not stop. That cry reaches heaven before the rain begins. And the rain does not begin until after one more figure enters the story. Not a warrior, not a king, a witness. A man who walked between the world that was breaking and the judgment that was coming. His name was Enoch. And what he saw, no other human being was shown. Chapter 6, 480 words. He did not pick up a weapon. He did not lead an army. Enoch walked. That is the detail Genesis gives, brief, almost casual, before the text moves on. Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, because God took him. No grave, no burial record, no death announcement. Just an ordinary man who lived in the most violent, most corrupted era in human history, and somehow walked so closely with the divine that death itself did not apply to him the way it applied to everyone else. The Book of Enoch takes that man and places him at the center of something no human being had ever been asked to do. The Watchers, the same beings whose descent had broken the boundary between heaven and earth, whose forbidden knowledge had flooded human civilization with violence, whose offspring had consumed everything in reach, sent a message. They wanted Enoch to carry it upward. They wanted him to intercede on their behalf, to stand before the heavenly court and petition for mercy on behalf of beings who had caused the destruction of an entire world. Read that slowly. The Watchers asked a human being to speak for them before the divine. There is something almost unbearable about that reversal. These were beings of rank, of knowledge, of ancient power, and they were afraid. They could not present their own case. The text records that they were trembling. They could not even lift their eyes. And so they turned to Enoch, a man, a mortal, a descendant of the very humanity they had corrupted, and asked him to carry their petition. Enoch carried it. The Book of Enoch describes him entering a visionary state, being taken upward through heavenly realms, and standing before a presence so overwhelming that the text uses crystal, fire, and deep cold to describe the atmosphere. Physical sensations standing in for something the human language of the ancient world could not fully contain. He delivered the petition. He waited. The response was not mercy. The Watchers were told through Enoch that their petition was denied. The text records the specific charge against them, that they had been holy, had been given a spiritual position, had carried a responsibility over the earth, and had abandoned it. They had sought things that belonged to mortal men, and now mortal men were crying out from the damage they had caused. Enoch was not the deliverer of good news. He was the messenger of a verdict, and the verdict carried weight that would not be reversed. The Watchers had asked for peace. The answer they received was judgment. The judgment was not only for them, it was for everything they had set in motion: the knowledge, the offspring, the violence, the corruption that had entered human history like water entering a cracked foundation. And water, in fact, was exactly what was coming. The Book of Enoch should not exist in the condition it exists in today. That is the first thing to understand. Texts that disturb the powerful tend to disappear. Texts that expand on uncomfortable passages in Scripture tend to get pushed to the edges, debated, dismissed, or quietly left out of the canon that ordinary believers receive on Sunday morning. The Book of Enoch was quoted, referenced, and clearly known in the ancient world. And then, across most of the Western Christian tradition, it faded. But in the highlands of East Africa, something different happened. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church did not let it fade. This is one of the oldest Christian institutions on earth, a church that traces its origins to the 1st century, to the account in Acts 8 of an Ethiopian court official who encountered the gospel and carried it home. That church developed its own canon, its own liturgical tradition, its own relationship to the sacred texts of the ancient world, and in that canon, the Book of Enoch held a place.
It's the origin of evil spirits in Second Temple literature. So when you're reading through Second Temple literature, the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Enoch, elsewhere, it tells us that these Nephilim become these warrior kings, but they're also savage.
The complete text of 1 Enoch survived in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of the Ethiopian Church, when it had vanished from Greek and Latin traditions almost entirely. For centuries, European scholars knew Enoch only through fragments and references. They knew other ancient writers had read it. They could see the fingerprints of Enochic thought across early Jewish and Christian literature, but the full text was gone from their libraries. Then, in 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce traveled through Ethiopia and brought back 3 manuscripts of 1 Enoch. That moment cracked the Western scholarly world open. The book scholars had been tracing in fragments for centuries. It had been sitting whole and intact in Ethiopian churches the entire time, preserved, copied, treated as sacred. That is not a small detail. That is a statement about where memory survives when institutions stop protecting it. The Ethiopian tradition did not preserve Enoch because of rebellion against other churches. It preserved it because it was part of the inheritance. Because monks in mountain monasteries copied it page by page, generation after generation, in a language that most of the world had never learned to read, sacred memory does not always travel to the center. Sometimes it travels to the edges, and sometimes the edges are where the most important things survive. What the Western world dismissed as a marginal text, Ethiopia kept as a foundation. And then, in 1947, the desert did something no one expected. It talked back. A young Bedouin shepherd threw a stone into a cave near the Dead Sea and heard something break. That sound, in 1947, would change the history of biblical scholarship permanently. What shattered inside that cave was a clay jar. Inside the jar were scrolls, ancient scrolls, wrapped and preserved in one of the driest environments on earth, tucked into the limestone cliffs above the site known as Qumran, on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. The scrolls were not planted there. They were not arranged for future discovery. They were hidden likely during the 1st century, when the community that preserved them faced destruction and had no other option. The Dead Sea Scrolls, as the collection came to be known, contained fragments and full copies of biblical books. They contained community rules, hymns, and prophetic commentaries. And they contained something that directly changed how scholars understood the ancient world's relationship to the Book of Enoch. Among the Qumran fragments were portions of one Enoch itself written in Aramaic, predating the Ethiopian manuscripts by over 1,000 years. Multiple copies, fragments from several of the major sections of the text. This was not a text that one obscure community had invented. This was a text that an ancient Jewish community living in the desert, likely before the time of Jesus, had copied and preserved with the same seriousness they gave to the books of Moses and the Psalms. But the scrolls did not stop there. Scholars also found fragments of a related text called the Book of Giants, a composition that expands directly on the Nephilim tradition. It describes the giant offspring of the Watchers by name. It describes their dreams, their violence, their awareness that judgment was approaching. Fragments of the Book of Giants were found in multiple caves at Qumran, suggesting it was not an afterthought or a single scribe's project. It was circulating. It was being read. It was part of the ancient conversation about Genesis 6 that was alive and active long before any modern internet debate. This is the part that silences every argument that these traditions are recent inventions. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove that the Nephilim, the Watchers, the fallen heavenly beings, and the judgment that followed these were not ideas that appeared in the modern age. They were ancient. They were serious. They were being studied, copied, and preserved by real communities with real theological commitments over 2,000 years ago. The caves near Qumran did not create a new mystery. They confirmed that the mystery was always there, older than any church council, older than any canon debate, waiting in the dark and the dry air for someone to finally ask the right question. And the New Testament had already been asking it for 2,000 years. 2 letters in the New Testament treat the rebellion of heavenly beings as a fact that requires no introduction, not a rumor, not a theological question still under debate. A fact stated plainly, referenced as common knowledge, used as a warning for the living. The letter of Jude, verse 6, states that angels who did not keep their own position but abandoned their proper dwelling have been kept in eternal chains under darkness until the judgment of the great day. The language is specific. Position, proper dwelling, chains, darkness. This is not poetic decoration. This is a theological statement about real beings who made a real choice and now face a real consequence. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4 mirrors it directly. God did not spare angels when they sinned. but cast them into darkness and committed them to chains, to be kept until judgment. Both letters. Same event, same consequence. Same tone of settled, unquestioned fact. And then Jude goes further. Jude, verse 14, quotes directly from the book of Enoch. Not paraphrases it, quotes it. He identifies Enoch as the seventh from Adam, which matches the genealogy in Genesis, and records a statement attributed to Enoch about the coming judgment of the Lord with 10,000s of his holy ones. That quotation exists in 1 Enoch chapter 1, verse 9, word for word. The New Testament writer of Jude reached into the book of Enoch and pulled a specific line out and placed it inside a letter that became part of the Christian biblical canon. Think about the weight of that for a moment. A text that most Western Christians have never read supplied a direct quotation to a book they carry in their Bibles every week. The connection is not theoretical, it is textual, it is documented. It has been studied by scholars for over 2 centuries, and the conclusion does not change. Jude knew 1 Enoch, treated it seriously enough to quote it, and did not feel the need to explain or defend that choice to his original audience. Because his original audience already knew the text, the early Christian world was not unfamiliar with the Enochic tradition. The themes of angelic rebellion, forbidden knowledge, judgment reserved for spiritual beings who violated their station, these were not foreign ideas that had to be introduced carefully. They were part of the shared memory of the ancient world. That shared memory did not vanish. It only became unevenly distributed. And what that uneven distribution cost the modern reader is exactly what this entire journey has been circling toward. Genesis 6 closes its door quietly. The Nephilim are mentioned. The violence is noted. God looks at the earth and grieves. Noah finds favor. The ark is built. The rain begins. And the world that existed before the flood, the world of the Watcher's descent, Azazel's forbidden instruction, the Nephilim's consumption, and the earth's unanswered cry disappears beneath 40 days of water. The Bible does not linger there. It moves forward. But the memory did not move forward at the same speed in every community. Ethiopia kept Enoch. Qumran copied it. Jude quoted it. The early Christian imagination held the full weight of what Genesis 6 implied, that the violence before the flood was not simply human failure. It was the result of a boundary being crossed by beings who knew exactly what they were crossing. That is the terrifying truth the title of this documentary pointed toward from the beginning. And it is not terrifying because of the size of the Nephilim. It is terrifying because of what they represent. Spiritual rebellion at the highest level produces consequences that reach the lowest level. The Watchers had rank, knowledge, and responsibility, and they abandoned all three. The knowledge they spread through Azazel did not stay with the generation that first received it. It compounded. It multiplied into the civilization that the flood finally washed away. And the warning preserved in Enoch is not a warning about ancient giants. It is a warning about what happens when power operates without accountability. When knowledge moves faster than conscience. When the line between what is permitted and what is forbidden gets treated as optional by those with enough strength to ignore it. That warning is not old. That warning is alive. The Ethiopian Church preserved it through 1,000 years of manuscript culture because the monks who copied it understood something the modern world keeps having to relearn. Memory is not passive. Memory is an act of resistance against forgetting. Every page copied by candlelight in a mountain monastery was a choice, a decision that this text mattered, that what it contained was too important to lose. The West forgot. Ethiopia remembered. And now the question is not whether Enoch belongs in the Bible. The question is what the reader does with the memory that was preserved. Genesis gave the doorway. Ethiopia kept it open. Qumran confirmed it was ancient. Jude quoted it without apology. Maybe Enoch was not preserved to satisfy curiosity. Maybe it was preserved to warn every generation that comes after the flood that the boundary still exists. And someone is always deciding whether or not to cross it. If this documentary made you think, made you question, or made you look at Genesis 6 differently, drop your thoughts in the comments below. This conversation matters, and your perspective adds to it. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new documentary on the hidden roots of sacred history, ancient texts, forgotten traditions, and the deeper mysteries of the Bible. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. The stories that were almost lost deserve to reach as many ears as possible.